Hello Whisky fans, welcome back. 23rd of December, let's see what Whisky Santa has in store for us today. I'm quite pleased that I've managed to open most of these without completely ripping the front off the advent calendar so far. There's still time yet. Okay, so a little bit of an unknown this time. This is the Perspective Series 21-year-old from Berry Brothers and Rudd, which is a blended Scotch whisky at 43% ABV. So, never heard of this one before, no idea what it is, so I'm going to have a quick nose and taste, maybe do a little bit of a research and find out what it is. But being a blended Scotch whisky, I must admit, self-confessed whisky snob a little bit, I would be surprised if this one is going to be on number one place, because I do tend to like single malt Scotch whisky. I think I've probably said before that blended whisky, especially blended malts, have their place and they can be phenomenal, but they tend not to be for economic reasons. And I generally think that single malt, especially when it's a true small batch, when it's a mix of 2, 3, 4 or no more than half a dozen casks, generally gives you the best whisky, and to my taste at least, especially when it's sort of in the mid-teens or older. So I'll be very surprised if this one is going to place really highly on our leaderboard, but you never know. I'm actually slightly glad that it did say blended Scotch whisky on the label there, because other than that I would be going in trick shot there, I would be going in completely blind with this one. Berry Brothers and Rudd are an independent bottler of whisky, for anyone that doesn't know, and they've been around for a really long time. They do know what they're doing, and they quite often release some of the better independent bottled whiskies. So that's quite nice. So the nose on this one it's one of those noses that changes quite a bit as you nose it. As you put the glass to your nose, you're getting quite a lot of sweetness, and it doesn't smell young either. Actually, obviously it's a 21-year-old whisky, it says on the label. I completely forgot about that. But yeah, it doesn't smell young at all. But the nose does go through a progression as you nose it. So straight away when you put it to your nose, you're getting some notes of sweet green apples and some really nice playful sweetness. Actually getting some flashbacks to the Jura 18-year-old from yesterday, and I suppose in hindsight that kind of makes sense, because if you've got a 21-year-old blended Scotch, especially if there's a high content of malt whisky in there, it probably makes sense that it will have at least some similarities to the 18-year-old Jura. There are some slightly odd notes towards the end of the nose though. As it goes on, I'm getting more dry, slightly mineral, salty notes. Yeah, constantly changing between those two. You've got a really nice contrast between some sweet green apple and confectionery, really fruity, juicy notes, and it's offset quite nicely by those drier, saltier notes. Also getting some really fleeting, hard to pin down notes of some really old malt whisky in there. A lovely nutty, oily, walnut, really well-aged malt whisky note. And true to form, the longer that I nose this whisky, because I am editing bits out of this video, or I assume I probably will be, so whenever I nose a whisky on here I am taking more time than it appears that I am when you watch this video, but the longer I nose this one, it does develop quite nicely. Already those slightly harsher, more challenging mineral salty notes, they're fading, and they're being replaced by more of that sweet, fruity, appley spirit and more of those really well matured old malt notes. So it actually turns out that I may have been completely wrong here, because I said that I'd be very surprised if this places highly on the leaderboard, because I was expecting this to be something like the Green Isle, which is a blended whiskey. Or what other blends have we had on here? Is that the only blend? There must be another blend. Okay, that's the only blend so far, this and the Green Isle. But yeah, this is much, much, much better than the Green Isle. I really do like that wonderful nutty, oily walnut aroma that you get from those really well-aged whiskies. And from that, I'm going to guess that some of the whiskey that's gone into this is older than 21. I think some of this is definitely at least up into the 25-year-old mark. I'm really curious to know how much an actual bottle of this costs now, because I bet this is probably cheaper than you'd expect for a 21-year-old whiskey, but I bet it's really not cheap. Let's see how it tastes. Looking forward to this. Just going back to the nose there's some really lovely aromas in this one. I'm so surprised at this. Beautiful, lovely green apples, tiny little hint of smokiness. Not a peat smoke, possibly just coming from the cask. But it really does smell so well matured, lovely old whiskey. And on the palate, it's so delicate but also intense, but in a refined and slightly restrained way. What is the ABV on this? 43%. So it's always such a criminal offence when you get a lovely old whiskey and it's bottled at too low a strength and you don't get the full experience. But that hasn't happened here. They've just got away with it at 43%, in my opinion. I don't think I'd dare add water to this whiskey because it's that good. And I quite often find, me personally, when you add water to a whiskey that's had heavy cask finishes or whiskies that are very old, they often don't take water too well, and I'm terrified that this one's going to fall apart and it just won't be as wonderful if I add any water at all. So on the palate, again, I'm getting some lovely sweet apple notes, also a little bit of apple peel, some strawberry. It's a beautiful creamy whiskey, some just a wonderful creamy maltiness, and the mouthfeel as well is just a lovely full coating creaminess as well. It's a little tiny bit of smoke again, some bitter honey, I'm describing it as, and you quite often get things like that when you get a really well matured whiskey that gets into its, especially when you get into the 20s, sort of mid-20s especially, you quite often get flavours which aren't necessarily things that you can identify. They become combinations of things that you recognise. And that's actually one of the reasons why I'd say if someone is a complete beginner in whiskey, don't spend the money on your especially 20, 25-year-old whiskies, because you need some experience first. When you get a whiskey of this calibre, someone that's not used to identifying the basic flavours, they might try this, and for want of a better word, it's a bit of a mean and snobbish thing to say, but it might be a little bit wasted on them, because there's just so much going on in a whiskey like this that sometimes it's hard to actually know what's happening, because you're just almost deafened and blinded by the vast array of all these wonderful flavours. One flavour that does keep coming back on this one though, especially on the late palate, is that lovely old oily maltiness. And it reminds me a little bit of the sort of nutty, oily, malty, well-aged notes that you get in something like a Bal Blair in the 25 to 30-year-old range. And those apple notes, it also reminds me a little bit of the antique bottle that I reviewed of the Highland Park 12-year-old from the 1980s, because I really do think that although they're calling this a 21-year-old whiskey, it must be at least quite a lot of it, quite a bit older than that, or it definitely seems it to me. As for the fact that this is labelled as blended Scotch, implying that there's grain whisky in here, I'm not getting much at all to suggest that there is grain whisky in this. So I'd say that there's a really high percentage of malt content in this whisky. That's really wonderful stuff. But again, I just got a little fleeting hint there of that salty mineral, slightly challenging hard bitterness that I got before, especially early on the nose. Just a little popped its head up a little bit, just a little glance of that again. And that's one of the things that I really like about old whiskey, because they change and develop, and it's not one constant experience. It constantly changes and evolves, and there's always something else to pick out and something else to look at and experience. Absolutely, a blind tasting, there's no way that I would guess that this is blended Scotch. Definitely wouldn't guess that there's any sort of real grain content in there. I would guess that this is a 20 to 25-year-old single malt whiskey. I would guess that this is a multi-vintage single malt whiskey, 20, 25 years old, and it's really good. I've actually got no idea how expensive this is, and I'm really hoping that it's not that expensive, because I'll be honest, I want a bottle. I would imagine, being 21 years old, you'd expect that to be over £100, maybe towards the 130, 140 mark here in the UK. But being independently bottled, you would hopefully expect it to be a little bit cheaper than if it was a 21-year-old from one of your major distilleries. So I'm going to guess this is probably sells for around the same price point as the Dalmore Cigar Malt, which is a very expensive whiskey. But I must say, I would rather have the Perspective Series 21-year-old from Berry Brothers and Rudd any day of the week over the Dalmore Cigar Malt. So let me know in the comments section what you think of this whiskey, because I'm about to do something a little bit controversial. There we go.